Welcome you all. This is the video lecture for Chapter 3 of CHD 210, Adaptations for Children with Specific Disabilities. In Chapter 2, we found that it will be useful with all children. Many children have special needs that require some kind of specific adaptation. However, it's important to know that in many of the cases, you may need a specialist. And sometimes those specialists just are not available to us. So that is why the information that we're going to talk about in Chapter 3 will help you identify some of the most critical needs and strategies for use with children with the following conditions. So we're going to talk about Down syndrome, visual impairment, hearing impairment, cerebral palsy, and autism. And here are just the objectives, and you can go back over those and look at those. Okay, so let's start off with Down syndrome. Down syndrome is one of the most common disorders characterized by intellectual disability. And according to the National Down Syndrome Society, children with Down syndrome typically demonstrate cognitive delays. However, these cognitive challenges are often mitigated by many of their strengths and talents. They have notable strengths in social skills. They're usually just very outgoing, friendly children and people. They have lots of visual memory and musical talents. And although speech and language skills are typically delayed, they have like the use of a picture communication system are often very common and work well for students with Down syndrome. So before you see some of the characteristics, and some of them are ones that you probably recognize, or if you've been around children or an adult with Down syndrome. Of course, Down syndrome is a chromosomal condition. And so there's usually some features because of the chromosomes, okay? So they, a lot of times they're short in stature, they have shorter fingers, and they have a lot of like creases in their palms, okay? Motor control, they usually delayed because they have slow muscle tone, but they'll be walking by the age of 2. Health concerns, maybe some heart malfunction or malformations, chronic mouth breathing, mild to moderate hearing loss. Those are some of the health concerns that might come along with being Down syndrome. Of course, cognition and learning style is where we may, in a school setting, actually be focusing our attentions. And although the average range of cognitive ability for children with Down syndrome is on the moderate range, you should also be aware that there is a very wide range of cognitive levels in children with Down syndrome. And they range from severe to mild cognitive disability, okay? Social, they're very responsive typically and prefer social interactions over probably like interactions with objects, computers, those kinds of things. They much prefer that one-to-one, okay? So many times children with Down syndrome, they demonstrate lots and achieve lots of the same developmental milestones as children without disabilities. They're low task persistent, okay, and they do have notable strengths in social skills. Some of the effective teaching strategies you might find are right here from just slowing down the pace, breaking it into incremental, small, digestible steps for them. Start at the end and work backwards. So you show them what you want them to know, then work backwards from that step. And then just repeating those key words or those same movements so that they learn those. Okay, autism. Autism offers a very significant challenge to educators and families. It used to be thought to be a rare disorder. However, the numbers continue to increase. suggesting that it is essential that early childhood educators be prepared to support and include children who may be on the autism spectrum. And one thing that's interesting about autism to note is that it is usually more prevalent in boys, okay? So that's one thing you might want to think about. Kind of the hallmark of an autism disorder is the significant delay or inappropriate use of language. That's kind of what it is characterized by, okay? Common to all of the individuals on the broad spectrum is the poor development of their social skills, okay? Failure, and you see here one of the characteristics, number 2, failure to develop normal social relationships and interactions is probably the one of these characteristics that you see listed before you that really may interfere with a child with autism and their ability to be included or in inclusion in the school, okay? Because it's just their lack of social norms and acceptances. Let's just look a little bit at some of the things that are important to remember about autism. No two individuals on the autism spectrum appear to have identical symptoms, so it's very different. So you may have one year that acts and does things a certain way, next year, and that responded to a certain way that you taught. Next year won't work, and you'll have to come up with something else. A symptom may be mild in one child and then be severe in another one, which that's kind of common with all children. Children's abilities here vary widely. Some display incredible strengths, especially in memory, visual memory, and visual processing. And then many have very special interests that draw their focus, okay? We're going to talk a little bit about some of those things as we go through. These are just some commonly used strategies, which you can read a little bit more about in your textbook, okay? But these are the one things I wanted to talk to you about right here are the behavior challenges with children with autism. They're going to have those repetitive self-stimulatory actions like rocking back and forth, spinning. Sometimes those repetitive actions may come in the form of self-mutilation like picking, banging their heads on the table, you know, those kinds of things. They have very rigid ritualistic patterns, like they do things the same exact way. Like one that I can remember just from teaching is the way the child entered my classroom. He came in, he opened the door a certain way, and he followed the same path, okay, back to where his desk is, never once changing. Your book gives the example of like touching all the pictures on the wall as they enter into the school, and they do it every single time. One thing to think about is escape behaviors as well, like running away, and they give you very, very little warning. They'll just dart off, okay? Crawling into small spaces, covering their ears, screaming out loud, which goes into the absence of social responsiveness. Like if they just are not responsive sometimes, and also sometimes they have difficulty in complying with rules or regulations that are set forth in the classroom. One of the things you will definitely want to make sure is that you work closely with the child's family if they have autism. Try to reduce the noise in the classroom to the biggest, as extent as you possibly can. Use firm kind of pressure when touching the child, okay, like to guide them into a certain way. Be consistent about your consequences for unacceptable behavior, and that's really the case for any child, really, but more really with a person on the autism spectrum. So if this is what you tell them you're going to do, and you did it this way the first time, it needs to be that way all of the time for whatever their unacceptable behavior is. A lot of times you will see people use that visual cueing system for them, and speak in a quiet voice, like don't raise your voice. And of course, reach out to some specialists or people who can help you with this situation. All right, let's talk about cerebral palsy for just a minute. It's a neurological disorder that significantly affects a child's ability to control their movement. It generally is the result of some sort of insult to the brain that occurs either in utero or during birth. Okay, cerebral palsy is the most common motor disability among children of all ages. And before here, you see some of the characteristics that you might encounter with a child with cerebral palsy. One thing to think about, especially if you have a child with motor disabilities, and it is suggested that you position children who have significant motor disabilities so that their knees and their hips are bent kind of like at a 90-degree angle. I had a student in my classroom who had cerebral palsy one year, and she was wheelchair bound. And so we did that at that 90-degree angle, and then had a stool that she propped her feet on so that her feet were not dangling in her wheelchair. So that's something to be just to remember as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about vision impairment. Although the inclusion of a child with total blindness may be rare, children with low vision or whose visual impairment is combined with other disabilities is increasing, especially in the inclusive setting. One thing to remember is there are many types of visual impairment. It might be the child's only disability, or it may accompany other conditions like Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. Okay, one thing to remember is that there's three different types that we're going to talk about: total blindness, low vision, and cortical visual impairment. So it is estimated that about 25% of people who have visual impairment are totally blind. Okay, so that leaves you, 75% who fall into that low vision or cortical visual impairment category. So only 25% of people will be totally blind. Okay. And it's important also to note that nearly all children who have visual impairment have some type of usable vision. Okay, so they may have vision impairment, but they do have some usable vision. Total blindness are your legally blind people who are legally blind. Okay, low vision, low vision folks have some residual vision. They may have some things to do with like lighting and contrast. Might help them see better. Okay, and then there is the cortical visual impairment, and it's a severe neurological disorder. Okay, so let's move on. Lighting, be mindful of your lighting, the contrast. Okay, like place dark on light background, light on a dark background so they can see the difference. Distance, bringing things up closer. Okay, if they have tunnel vision, it might need to be further away. So make sure that you know exactly kind of what type of visual impairment the child might have, so that you can make sure that you use the strategies that work best for that child. Okay. The cortical visual impairment, remember this is the neurological disorder. So they may allow children to touch the objects while they're looking at them, place the objects far apart, which prevents visual crowding. Okay, bringing them up closer to the child, using contrasting colors. Those are some of the strategies that we work very well with children with cortical visual impairment. All right, let's look just a smidge at hearing loss. Many young children are going to have some form or some degree of hearing loss. It varies from severe, from mild to profound, and then of course in the type of loss that it might be. Now, because we have so many children who have ear infections, we see a lot of children with a hearing loss, sometimes a mild one, sometimes too even that might be significant, only because of having chronic ear infections. Okay, so when they have chronic ear infections that can just continue over and over and over again, you may see some hearing loss associated with that. IDEA uses the term hearing impairment to talk about or to denote children with hearing loss. So that's something to think about. It's not necessarily saying hearing loss, but hearing impairment. Okay. There's also a sensory neural hearing loss, and that is has to do with heredity. Okay. So you may have child who wears hearing aids. You may have to have speakers in your classroom. I had a hearing impaired child one time, so I had to wear a microphone. They came in and installed speakers, and so I spoke through the microphone, which really was written in the IEP of the student with a hearing who was hearing impaired, but it was also very beneficial for others because it helped all the other children as well, like stay on attention, calling a child's name, making sure that they can see your mouth, and because so many of them may be lip readers, so not covering in today's world with our mask. A lot of times that's, you may see why a lot of teachers in elementary schools are wearing shields or the mask with the open clear front, so that children with hearing impairment can read their lips. Okay, so that's another thing we might want to remember. Intellectual impairment, children may not respond as well, have less vocalization, play alone more, okay, with other. Hearing loss, impaired communication, inconsistent responses to communication attempts because they simply don't hear you, and then of course less interaction. One thing that is not on your on a slide that has to do with speech and language impairment. A lot of times you may hear of a child go into speech, and that's because they have a speech and language impairment. So a lot of times they may, they may have the inability to make informed sounds, so they might have a speech and go to speech and language, and sometimes they have a problem with something called pragmatics, and it's the appropriate and effective use of language in a social communication. So they just don't. Pragmatics has to do with the appropriate and effective use of language. So a lot of times, like about vocabulary. So you can just read through these, and this is a read, reflect, and discuss that's at the end of your textbook if you want to take a look at that. That's it for chapter 3.